Hello, and welcome to a Roaster's Guide to Coffee Seasons.
Hey folks, I'm Chris Kornman. I'm the Lab and Education Manager at the Crown, and I spent about a decade as a coffee buyer, and so I'm excited to talk to you a little bit today about harvest and arrival timelines for roasters.
The Crown is located at 2523 Broadway in Oakland, California. We're a lab and tasting room, as well as an event space and education center. You can read more about us online. Royal Coffee is the parent company of the Crown, family-owned and operated importer in business since 1978 in the Bay Area. And you are on our website right now. So the purpose of today's class is going to be to take a look closely at coffee arrival times and harvest times across the globe. We're going to spend a good bit of time looking at maps. We're also going to look at a couple of charts, including arrival data by volume over a number of seasons. And we'll dive into a few specifics, outliers and exceptions, and a few other anecdotal things that relate to the harvest and arrival timeline for coffees. There's lots of different harvest and arrival timeline charts out there, and I don't always find them to be typically that enlightening. Many times they're inaccurate or not inclusive enough. And I feel like it's pretty evident that even with those resources, roasters don't always understand exactly what seasonality might mean for a particular individual region. One of the most common things that we get asked at Royal is, how to find Central American coffees in the dead of winter, and those coffees just aren't available generally during that time. They're in a new harvest cycle. So if you look at this map, you can see a number of different regions outlined sort of generally by season. If you think of this as like winter in blue and yellow for spring and red for summer and purple for autumn, very roughly speaking. We're looking essentially at most northern hemisphere coffee growing regions beginning their harvest in the mid to late fall, and generally delivering coffee no earlier than late winter, early spring. And the inverse would be true for the southern hemisphere, those red regions being our summer harvesting areas, and the yellows being sort of the spring, summer. There's a couple of exceptions. This map isn't totally perfect. If you look at Colombia, for example, Colombia, with its position on the equator and its unique geography, and we'll get into this a little bit more detailed in a second, it doesn't really follow along those timeline norms. Sumatra is probably another similar one, whereas most of Indonesia is, in fact, engaging in harvest during April through June. Sumatra is split also by the equator, and the northern part of the island does not harvest at the same time as the southern part of the island. If you also look at East Africa, the Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia region tends to be pretty predictable and follows a standard northern hemisphere timeline, whereas the less frequently visited places like Democratic Republic of Congo or Zambia or even Malawi and Tanzania and Rwanda and Burundi are a little bit more varied. And because their harvests can be smaller in general by volume, they can vary pretty widely regionally in those countries as well. So this is the corollary to the previous map, and rather than showing harvest times, this is showing more common arrival times. And it's definitely worth noting that arrival timelines are, of course, contingent on when the coffee is harvested, but they're also contingent on a number of other factors, including the length of time it takes to ship and when contracts are drawn. And we'll look a little bit more specifically at some of those factors momentarily as well. But I wanted to take a look at this map and how it changed from the previous um, map of harvest times. And you can see in a lot of the same ways that this it's definitely regional and tends to be very hemisphere driven. In a lot of cases, we're looking at the next season or 2 season time frame between when a coffee might be picked off the tree and then when it actually arrives in the United States. So Central American coffees in the U.S., their proximity to our border is convenient, and therefore the coffees tend to arrive quickly. Mexican coffees, in some cases, we have an arrival time frame of something like 7 days from when it ships to when it arrives in our warehouse, depending on the supplier and the particular mode of transportation that they might be choosing. Again, Colombia's we can kind of expect to see almost year-round. Most of South America, we're looking at fall or winter arrivals. I would say that this Brazil, it does lean heavily in the fall, but we actually are receiving a lot of those coffees almost year-round. It's easier to stagger because of the crowded ports in Santos, and because if we were to take delivery of all of our Brazil contracts at once, we'd have a warehouse that couldn't keep pace with all the arrivals. Again, most of East Africa, we've got the predictable summer landings of our specialty coffees from Ethiopia and Kenya, whereas generally speaking, it's a winter and maybe if we're very lucky, a fall arrival for Rwanda, Burundi. And then Sumatra, Bali, Sulawesi, and Timor, those are mostly arriving in the winter for us. So this last global map is interesting for a number of reasons. In early 2020, it became pretty apparent that the pandemic of COVID-19 was beginning to spread globally, and Royal Coffee had a number of existing contracts already drawn up for most of the year at that point. When we began to close our operation at the end of March of that year, we were looking to secure a number of coffees to make sure that we had an appropriate amount in our warehouse ready to establish our portfolio for the rest of the year. With our day-to-day operations mostly come to a halt aside from a skeleton crew of QC and our traders working from home, and the warehouse, down to a minimum of staff that could take care of any orders that were being placed and any coffees that were coming in. Max and I drew up an outline for a webinar, and we presented this slide as a way to make some sense of what was actually here and what was not. It's interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, it gives a really interesting snapshot of a particular moment in time. April is a pretty common time frame for Central American coffees to begin arriving in the United States. And so you can see that coffees from Mexico, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras are all contracted and incoming at this point in time. We've got a significant position of Brazilian coffee that's still on our books, and that would all be obviously from the 2019 harvest. Colombia is looking really solid. We've got a ton of coffee that's recently landed from the Indonesian islands, Sumatra in particular. And then East Africa is actually a really interesting spot to look at as well. We've got a bunch of coffees from Uganda that mostly have not yet arrived at this time, but they're on the water, they're booked, and on the ocean. And then Ethiopia is bright red, indicating that there's a lot of that coffee, and that's maybe the prime example of a situation where we have an overlap in harvest seasons. We tend to carry a lot of Ethiopian coffees at Royal Coffee, and what we have at any given time is usually predominantly fresh crop, but in April we're not really anticipating our first landed Ethiopian coffees until perhaps really late May at the earliest, and June and July is kind of when that can typically start to peak. And so we have a bunch of coffee that's contracted from the 2020 harvest, or late 2019, I should say, harvest, and is on the water. But we also have a significant position of the previous harvest cycle that's actually in the warehouse currently. So a mix there of both current and past crop contracts. So coffee has a really, really long maturation period. Coffee flowers typically bloom after a brief rain and a hot, dry spell. And the cherry growth can take up to 6 months in many cases. Tropical weather tendencies with plenty of irregularities still differ pretty predictably by hemisphere. So the rains in Brazil, for example, in September and October typically result in flowering and then harvests that begin in May and June. Whereas late spring and summer rains in places like Mexico and Guatemala will typically produce mature fruit before the end of the calendar year. Um, and I would say that, for the most part, this holds true worldwide. Harvests of specialty quality Arabica occur during the hemispheric winter. Thus, based on nothing other than geography, you can know within a margin of error where cherries are being picked. Back when I used to do more traveling to purchase coffee, I'd usually try to time my visits to coincide with the peak of harvest. And I think that this is probably a pretty common convention for buyers visiting their producers. It affords the opportunity to cup some early harvest coffees and to take photos at almost every step of the process. If you're in the middle of harvest, you can usually get to see the cherries on the tree, but you can also often get to see the coffee being delivered to the washing station and observe the practices of washing, fermenting, and drying the coffee. And yet, even though the process has only just begun, you can still have a say in how the later picking lots might be able to turn out. Um, Even the smallest microregion may harvest for an extended period of time, depending on a lot of factors like weather or the plant variety and the available labor. And thus, if the yield is large enough, early harvest may be ready to ship as much as, in some cases, 4 or 5 months before the final pass for the season. And so, these large gaps of arrival time periods from the same origin can occur for no other reason than the fact that they were harvested months apart. Yet even coffees that were harvested simultaneously in different parts of the globe might arrive at our warehouse in different times. This can be due to processing methods. It takes a different amount of time to process a natural coffee than a fully washed coffee. And in many cases, there's sort of regional traditions, like Ethiopia tends to process their washed coffees first, and then the naturals come later in the season. Um, Logistic anomalies, how long it takes a truck to get to a port, whether or not the port is particularly busy during that season. Seasonal variations, if you have weather patterns that change year to year. The configuration of a trade route, perhaps a feeder vessel needs to meet up with the main ship that would be um, sending it sending the coffee to its final destination, and that might take time. And if the routes are crowded or logistics becomes problematic, sometimes those feeder vessels get skipped. Any customs holds can also delay coffees if there needs to be an inspection. There's always the possibility of political interferences or many other factors. Given this reality, even the best laid plans can't guarantee a coffee's arrival time. For example, one summer, Royal Coffee's shipments were delayed for a number of reasons. There was a hurricane that caused delays. Another container was delayed because it lacked the appropriate phytosanitary cert. And then Ethiopia's entire crop for that season arrived by an average of over a month later compared to previous. So various factors can obviously affect and have a dramatic impact on the difference between when a coffee is harvested, processed, and its arrival at its destination. Arrival times beyond being contingent on harvest are also typically subject to approval of samples. Coffees in most places in the world are not going to move to a new destination without a confirmed purchase or a buyer. Thus, even though a coffee from Costa Rica might be finished and ready to ship in April, a sample approval, a contract agreement, and a shipping schedule might not be arranged until June or August. All this is to say that for most given purchases at Royal Coffee, the date of debarkation at the port of Oakland is likely more related to when we approve a sample than when it was actually picked and processed. The relationship between harvest period and sampling may be implied, but nothing should be assumed as a given. So now that we've talked about some general outlines for the way that things usually work, let's look at a few exceptions. There are a lot of these, but one of the primary ones might be a secondary harvest cycle, which is known as a fly crop or mitaka. And these are irregular summer harvest periods, usually marked by lower volumes and sometimes lower quality as well. Interestingly, a lot of folks are familiar with Kenya. It's known for a quantity of its fly crop, and I think this might have a couple of reasons. First of all, the supply from Kenya tends to be relatively limited in terms of their main crop period, and so during the winter months in the northern hemisphere, it can be challenging for roasters to keep up with demand, and so having that fly crop option as a second opportunity to buy coffees from Kenya can sometimes fill a gap. It also tends to be cheaper. And it does frequently tend to be lower in quality. It's hard to find the kinds of like really exceptional coffees that we expect from places like Niyuri and Kirinyaga during that fly crop. Another common anomaly might be Colombia. Many representatives of the Colombia Coffee Growers Federation, known as the FNC, typically repeat the claim that in Colombia the harvest is year-round, and this is a little bit of a misnomer. The unique positioning of the country on the Earth's equator, in combination with the way that the Andean mountain range splits the country into three major spines, produces a highly variable rainfall cycle throughout the country. Multiple regions also experience the mitaka, and in Colombia, you can definitely get bulked Colombian coffee without regional traceability, generally speaking, year-round. But it's not necessarily true that every place in Colombia is harvesting at all times. In fact, it's definitely not true. We're going to take a look at a map. It's also actually kind of true that in most countries that are producing significant volumes of coffee, they'll carry a stock of generic bulked regional coffees that will typically hang out in a warehouse for, a year or more. And so you could kind of say the same thing about like Brazil or Tanzania or wherever, that these coffees are still available. They're just they haven't been recently harvested. Back to Colombia. In general, the country's most coveted traceable specialty coffees from places like Cauca, Huila, and Nariño tend to have their harvest during the northern hemisphere's summer. That would be like April, May, June, July. And those coffees are often going to arrive stateside, between October and January. Pretty comparable to neighboring Ecuador and Peru, for example. However, some of the more traditional growing regions in the north and center of the country, places like Santander and Antioquia, and in the north in Magdalena, tend to act a little bit more like northern hemisphere harvests that, that pick the coffee during our fall and our winter months, and those will arrive during the spring and summer for the North American market. But even within individual departments in Colombia, regions might vary wildly enough to have completely different harvests. So let's take a look at the map on the next slide, which is FNC intellectual property, and you can observe the stark variation in relatively small distances due to things like topography, trade winds, rain cycles, and various other environmental factors. So, examining the claim that coffees from Colombia are actually available year-round, harvesting all year, you can get really technical and call out the fact that in the map here, January, February, July, and August are actually not represented anywhere here. But beyond trying to pick holes in this argument that doesn't really matter that much, what we do have here is a fairly clear sense of the differing regional variations in harvest cycles. So starting in the north of the country, the Sierra Nevada range and Magdalena, Cesar, and La Guajira is harvesting in that green cycle, which is the fall months for the northern hemisphere, and that cycle kind of extends down mostly towards the center of the country in green there, and below that in the southern parts of the country, we start to see a lot more variation. This is kind of where the Andes begins to kick in. That major regions of Cauca, Valle de Cauca, Tolima, and Caldas there right in the center. Cundinamarca. So all of those areas have a bit of a range, and typically we'll also have a second harvest, that Mitaka that we talked about. And then in the far south, Nariña and Cauca predominantly acting kind of like a southern hemisphere country, with their harvest being in the like March, April, May, June time frame, and we're looking at those arrivals, in the United States in the fall and winter. So if we bulk all of this Colombian coffee together as one generic origin, the country of Colombia, rather than its regional distinction, what we end up getting is this kind of two spikes in arrivals for the United States. This chart comes courtesy of some pretty impressive numbers wrangling. Our logistics specialist and inbound team member Jody Lowe's dug through a bunch of data for me and helped me sort literally thousands and thousands of shipping and arrival data points related to shifting seasons and coffee shipments. So what you're looking at here is about 3 years worth of data, January 2016 through October 2018, and displaying these monthly coffee arrivals by volume from Colombia. The vertical bars are the 3-year summary, that's the sum, and then the horizontal lines are individual years. So what we have here is a pretty clear peak in March, and then again in August through the December. And generally speaking, those can be tied to some of those major regions that are producing, harvesting, processing, and exporting their coffees in different time frames. Looking at the same time frame and same volume data, but located in Ethiopia, what we have is a pretty clear singular peak of our arrival, typically between the months of May and October, with almost nothing landing between November and February. It's pretty clear that the country is exporting its coffee in a relatively narrow time frame, and we're receiving it in, consequentially relatively narrow time frame. It's also worth taking a look at those individual lines, and if you'll notice in 2016 we had a very early peak in June of that year for the bulk of our arrivals, whereas in 2018 the yellow line we didn't peak until August, and so I think that this highlights some fairly dramatic swings in things like harvest cycles related to whether it be climate or any number of other factors. So even within a single country that has a relatively narrow defined range, we still see some of these variations year to year. We can dig in a little bit further and take a look at what I would say are probably at least 4 contributing factors to the later than usual arrivals from Ethiopia in recent years. One might be political. The country's had a number of tumultuous years with popular uprisings, especially in the south, near where many of the coffee washing stations that we work with operate. Leadership has, changed relatively dramatically, and regions like Sidama are vying for independent recognition. add to this a major overhaul on the way that the ECX operates, including increased transparency and a major amendment that passed in the summer of 2017 that reshaped the ECX in a pretty dramatic form, allowing for specialty buyers to locate and work directly with any farmer or producer group that can produce 20 or more Ethiopian quintals of coffee, about 4,400 pounds. It means that the independent non-ECX members and cooperatives can now engage and trade directly with roasters and importers instead of having to go through the ECX, which, while you might consider this to be an efficiency in the supply chain, in fact, what we have is a lot of players who previously haven't had access to those kinds of markets trying to navigate their access points, and we're finding some of those may have resulted in delays as well. A significant reason in the 2018 late harvest, per Royal Coffee CEO Max Nicholas Fulmer, was that the main reason was climatic. Basically, we had there was rain delays that particular season. And lastly, also possibly related to weather, in that year, Royal Coffee intentionally delayed the approval of a number of our what would have otherwise been early samples, and instead waited for later higher quality samples to cross our cupping table. So in addition to an already late cycle, we delayed even further that season, waiting for the best possible coffees. And I think that all this, comes together to highlight the fact that there's just a ton of factors and a lot of intangibles that can affect harvest, shipment, and arrival dates. It's not really rocket science necessarily, but it is nice to have some hard data and visual aids to help disambiguate this process. And so why don't we take a look at a few more charts from a couple of what we might call the usual suspect countries and get a sense of where coffees are coming in from these places. Brazil, the global leader in coffee exports by volume for a very long time now, has a well-defined harvest cycle in April through September, and we start seeing those earliest landed coffees typically in that October, November sort of time frame. Those are your freshest Brazil coffees. Interestingly, what we do see is other spikes throughout the year, and this is in part due to that fact that I mentioned earlier, that we're staggering our purchase and arrivals and deliveries in order to better accommodate that large volume of coffee. So while we do obviously contract a ton in the November, December months to arrive, we're also needing coffees earlier and later in the year. And so by positioning and planning our coffee imports accordingly, we can be able to supply the needs of our customers over a longer period of time. Costa Rica, located in Central America, is very clearly got that winter harvest cycle going on, where the coffees are coming off the trees in October, November, December, January, and February in some cases, and then the shipments really begin to pick up starting in March, April, and the bulk of the Costa Rican coffee has arrived in May, June, and July, and a few stragglers in August and September, and really nothing at all during our winter months. A real classic example of a Central American Northern Hemisphere arrival time frame. Guatemala, similarly, relatively compact time frame and about the same time constraints. What we see here is a little bit more drawn out and a few early arrivals. Guatemala is producing a significant amount of coffee in different regions that have slightly different cycles, a little bit more dramatically so than Costa Rica. And so we really push to get those early landing Guatemalan coffees on our offer sheet as soon as possible, and then fill in with the later stuff as it arrives in May and June, being kind of the bulk landing times for those countries. Down to the southern hemisphere in Peru, we see exactly the opposite cycle, where the coffee is harvesting during the April, May, June, July time frame, and we're starting to get our first major shipments during the August, September, October, November time frame. It's a winter arriving coffee, and even though we do have demand for this coffee year-round, the capacity for actually being able to take deliveries of it year-round is not as significant as a place like Brazil, and so we're really trying to get as much of that coffee in as fresh as possible. Papua New Guinea here with a fun, slightly unpredictable time frame. Generally speaking, it's going to be landing in that August, September, October time frame. Those are like our winter months in the Northern Hemisphere are going to be the bulk of arrivals for that country, but it can swing pretty dramatically year to year, and we do from time to time see delayed shipments as late as January, February, March, in some cases from that previous year's harvest cycle. I mentioned earlier that Sumatra is sort of an anomaly in the same way that Colombia is, where coffee from this country, depending on whether it's grown in the north or the southern parts, can arrive in completely different time frames. And so we have that sort of double peak here, just like we saw with Colombia, where there's a lot of coffee coming in during the late winter, January, February, March, and also a lot of coffee coming in the June, July, August time frame, depending on which part of the country it might have been grown in. I'd like to acknowledge Daily Coffee News and Roast Magazine as an early version of this document was first published there in November 7th of 2018. And just reiterate that the intellectual property here is that of Royal Coffees, and that this is an original presentation. And that we have also republished with permission the original article on our own blog. You can, of course, always visit royalcoffee.com and check additional resources there, whether it's crown jewels or information on the crown itself, or our blog for further information and educational materials. And you can always come visit us at 2523 Broadway, or email us at info@royalcoffee.com, or dial the number below to get in touch. Look forward to hearing from you, and thanks for listening.